Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll get started.
This story begins in a beautiful office, where a press conference was taking place. When the presentation was over, one of the office managers shook his assistant's hand and said that everything had gone well. Of course, the guy was incredibly happy about this because he tried very hard on this presentation, and he was happy to see that other people liked it too. The boss, smiling, turned to the guy and said that he invited him to come to him that evening in order to properly celebrate his success. The guy thanked him, of course, for such a wonderful offer, but said that he would be busy, so he would not be able to come. He turned around and began to leave in order to take care of his business after a hard day. The boss, of course, was very angry when he heard the refusal and asked him not to be reckless and to think about it. But the man insisted on his own and replied that he had things to do, so they would definitely not be canceled. Some time passed from that moment, and the man finally returned to his hotel, where he lived for some time in a very nice room. The guy immediately began to undress because the tie was incredibly tight on his neck. He also went to check new messages on his phone, but there were none. Just as he was about to take off his shirt, a woman suddenly knocked on the door and immediately opened the door without even asking permission. Of course, the guy immediately got angry and asked if she hadn't seen the sign on the door. He had put it up specifically so that no one would bother him, not even the service staff. But the girl ignored his words. She went in and, closing the door behind her, asked for forgiveness. She looked quite relaxed, but at the same time she was very embarrassed and worried. The stranger, smiling happily, said that she just wanted to take a photo with him and asked if she could do it. The guy, because he was very narcissistic, and even despite his tiredness, agreed to this and said that she could take pictures, but only quickly. She walked quickly closer to him and apologized again for holding him up. After that, she moved so close to take a photo that the guy even felt uneasy about it. After she took a few photos, the phone just slipped out of her hands. She immediately looked very surprised, even though she did it on purpose. The girl immediately asked him for forgiveness and said that she had always been so clumsy, and at that moment began to bend over to pick up her thing. However, the girl did not sit down. She began to bend over in such a way that her expressive body parts became even more noticeable. The man, of course, like any person, paid attention to this, but rather quickly looked away from her in order not to seem rude. Soon she finally got up and took out her phone. The man immediately asked if everything was okay with him, but she replied in a sad voice that the screen was cracked and very upset. She also said that she was really a very clumsy person, and this always caught her off guard. At that moment, she folded her arms in such a way that several buttons on her shirt came undone, and her breasts began to stick out even more. She began to get very worried, and suddenly, waving her hand, the girl said that it was becoming more and more stuffy in that room. This stranger began to approach the businessman closer and closer. She even put her hands on his chest. He didn't understand at all who she was, so he answered in a casual voice that the air conditioner was working reliably, and in principle, he wasn't hot. The girl continued to seduce this guy, and in a very quiet and sexy voice asked if maybe he could help her cool down. Of course, the guy was angry about this whole situation. He grabbed her hand very hard. The girl did not expect him to do this, so she even screamed. When she looked him straight in the eye, the man smiled happily and said that she really was a complete idiot or simply didn't understand something. He continued to hold her hand and asked if maybe she also went to other offices like this just to take pictures and then brazenly pestered people. After he said these words, he suddenly pulled her hand away from himself and told her to disappear immediately. Of course, this attractive lady immediately became angry because her plan had completely failed. She decided to take revenge on him, and touching her shirt with one hand, pulled it so that some buttons simply flew off from there, and she began to show him her underwear. The woman said that he would answer for everything, and also said that especially for the fact that he harassed her. But the guy didn't care at all that this woman was threatening him there. He said that she could do whatever she wanted. It didn't matter to him at all. The girl continued to play her meaningless role. She ran out of the room and continued to scream, asking for help, and talked about how she was being raped. She was running down the hallways, talking about how the guy in the room wanted to rape her. Her shirt was still unbuttoned, and her lipstick was smudged in some places. However, she was so inattentive that she didn't even notice the sign about slippery floors, and because she was running in high heels, she fell straight to the ground. She immediately burst into tears and said that she didn't know what to do. Her shirt was unbuttoning more and more, and her skirt was riding up even higher than it should have been. By that time, the boss, who also lived in that hotel, came running to the screams and immediately asked what had happened. As soon as he got to this girl, he immediately recognized her. It was Kim Leon, but he was surprised by what happened to her. By that time, the guy had already left his room to see what was going on, and besides, many people had also left their rooms because they were curious. As soon as some of the girls saw him, they immediately recognized him. It was the doctor who led the conference. They heard that he was very good at his job. In fact, he was only 25, and he already received a PhD degree. People didn't even think that such simple guys were capable of such a thing. His boss, as soon as he saw the guy, immediately got angry. He already wanted to hit him in the face, asking how he dared to do such a thing. However, the doctor had a good reaction and managed to dodge in time. People immediately took out their phones and started recording and photographing everything. The elderly man immediately felt a sharp pain in his hand because he had hit it with all his might right against the concrete wall. The doctor, smiling smugly, said that the guy was apparently quite hot-tempered and advised him to take care of his nerves in the future. The man who had arranged a special conference for him began to call him various curse words because he was incredibly angry. He then pointed towards Kim, who was still sitting on the floor, and said that he should be held responsible for the incident that had happened. The man claimed that he would never just let this go. He was going to fight to the end for justice. But the doctor was much smarter. As soon as this girl came in, he immediately realized that something was wrong. So he turned on the recorder and began recording their conversation. Rewinding to the right moment, he showed the man audio evidence of his innocence and of the girl brazenly pestering him. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately stopped playing her fake role. She was afraid that she would be judged, and the man who defended her was also surprised. He did not expect that she could behave like this. The people standing around also did not expect such a turn of events. They immediately began to whisper and discuss this scoundrel Kim. The boss immediately began to calm them down, saying that it was just a misunderstanding and words that were taken out of context. Kim quickly began to cover her body with her hands, since it was still exposed, and said that it was just a joke. She looked at the doctor and explained that she did it because she saw that he was in a bad mood, so she decided to lighten the mood a little. The man who defended her so fiercely was simply furious because she was burying them even deeper with her words. He didn't understand how anyone could be such an idiot, but the doctor broke their awkward silence and began to leave, saying that it wasn't all that important. He suggested that they just forget about the whole incident, since their contract had already been signed a long time ago. However, he also said that this time should be the last, and said goodbye to them. His boss immediately ran after the guy, trying to stop him because thanks to this brilliant doctor he had a good audience, and they had achieved a furor. The girl tried to stop him. She asked what they should do now because she was really worried about her reputation and future. The old man got tired of hearing all this. He hit the girl right in the face and said that she was simply disgusting. He miscalculated his strength, so the girl even fell to the ground. People immediately began to photograph it and condemn this man for such rude behavior. This doctor's name was Tung, and after leaving the hotel, he decided to leave altogether. He immediately opened the news on his phone to see what was being said. And the news reported that the director of the company, Hak Hung, and a girl from the same company had caused a big scandal. The special correspondent also told his viewers that as soon as they contact PhD Tung, they will find out all the details and will definitely tell others. The man, having heard all this, immediately breathed a sigh of relief and calmly drove to his home. It took a long time, and it was already getting dark outside. But as soon as he got to the right floor, he immediately entered the special password for his room and swiped the card that confirmed his identity. As soon as he opened his room, a knife flew next to him at great speed, which almost hit his head. Tung didn't even blink when it happened. He was a little surprised by the knife, of course, but he easily parried the blow that followed the weapon. It was quite an old man, and as soon as the boy was able to parry the blow, he immediately laughed and said that he, as always, was a good boy. By that time, a woman who was also no longer young came out of the other room. She hit her husband with a slipper and told him to stop doing that already. The woman did not understand why he was always trying to kill their dear and only son, because if he had missed even a little, he would have hit him right on his beautiful face. Tung's father immediately realized his mistake and, asking his wife for forgiveness, said that he only wanted to scare him and test his dexterity. The woman immediately moved her husband aside and, turning to her son, asked if everything was okay with him, and also asked him not to pay attention to his slightly crazy father. But Tung completely ignored his mother's words. He took the knife out of the wall and asked who it belonged to. His parents didn't answer. They just looked at their son in surprise. He then looked at them with suspicion and asked why they didn't want to talk. His father slowly pointed his finger at his mother but said nothing. He was actually sometimes even afraid of his son. The woman did not resist. She replied that he had indeed guessed her. She just wanted to test his reaction and see if he was doing well. Tung didn't react to this at all. He walked past his parents without saying anything, still holding the knife in his hands. He began to take off his tie again, which was constantly choking him, and asked if they had really come to his apartment just for this. His father immediately got angry. He started shouting at him and asked how such a guy even dared to talk to his parents like that. And the mother quickly calmed her husband down and asked her son why he was so angry, because this is a normal thing when parents visit their children. She also wondered if the incident with the girl that is constantly being talked about in the news was really true. Of course, as parents, they can always support him and will definitely be on his side. The woman always told Tung that if something happens, he should tell them first so that they don't worry. At that moment, the guy finally took off his tie and, sitting down on the sofa, asked his mother if she really wanted this news to be true so much. At first, these words shocked the woman, but she sat down next to him and asked why he was so rude, because they would never even think about such a thing. Tung sighed heavily, not responding to this. He just sat with his eyes closed, completely ignoring the presence of his parents in the house. His mother was even more wary because of this. She was very worried that their son might get very angry because they showed up without warning. She was also scared by this silence. After some time, he finally spoke and asked who it was this time. The woman immediately smiled and said that it was the wife of a friend of her father's in the neighborhood. Her father also wanted to support him somehow, but Tung interrupted them. He looked at his parents and asked why they were staring at him like that. But when they didn't answer, he asked them to give him the folder or he would change his mind about not being angry. His mother, with trembling hands, immediately handed him the folder with documents and said that it was all about that girl, so he could check with his own eyes. Tung took the folder without a word and began to study it carefully. There were some rather interesting documents in it. His parents were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief at that moment, because they really hoped that this information would be able to at least distract and calm their son a little. They decided not to stay long, so they soon got up and started to leave. The mother asked him to think about it carefully, and if he decided to do something, then let him try to meet this woman. His father, before finally leaving, also asked him to try not to spoil his opinion of himself, as in the past. His parents were really always worried about their dear son being left completely alone. Once they were gone, Tung studied the documents for a while. After that, he put the file aside and sighed heavily. He had certainly had a hard day. When the next day came, as he had promised his parents, Tung finally came to the meeting at a very beautiful cafe. There, at a table by the window, sat a girl. She ordered herself a coffee, and not far from her sat another guy. He was disguised, but he was watching her closely. The girl was incredibly nervous. Her hands were shaking and her gaze was lowered. She did not know what to do and was afraid to show her emotions in any way. But she didn't have to wait long and worry, because Tung appeared in the cafe quite quickly. He immediately saw her and came closer. As soon as their eyes met, the girl was surprised. Tung came even closer, extended his hand forward and greeted, already about to say his name. However, he did not have time to do this because the girl immediately stood up from her seat and hit him very hard on the cheek. Tung was incredibly surprised when she did this because he did not expect this at all and did not understand what was happening at all. To somehow justify her behavior, the girl said that he arrived later than the appointed time. She hated latecomers more than anything in the world, so she started yelling at him, saying that he had set the time himself. But in the end, he made her wait. She asked where he had ever seen such behavior in decent society, and, unable to contain herself, even began to call him names. The woman said that he had ruined their meeting, and that she definitely did not need such an irresponsible and terrible person. Tung, hearing this, could not resist and began to laugh very loudly, so much so that the people sitting nearby began to turn around and look at them. The girl was confused. She did not expect such a reaction and immediately asked why he was laughing. Had he really gone crazy? The guy couldn't calm down for a while, but then, waving his hand, he asked if her family had really forced her to come to this meeting. Without giving her time to respond, he said that she could not resist, so she decided to come and ruin their meeting by accusing him of being late or some other misbehavior. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised. Of course it was true, but she couldn't just admit it. Her hands shook even more. Soon she took her handbag and, hitting him on the shoulder, told him not to act smart. The girl also replied that no matter what he said before or after, it did not change the fact that he was late. It was his fault, not hers, that the meeting did not take place. Tung, of course, couldn't let her just leave like that, so before she ran away, he grabbed her hand. However, before Tung could come to his senses, the guy who had been sitting nearby had already run up to him and grabbed him by the clothes. He immediately looked him straight in the eye and asked him what he was doing, and also told him not to even think about touching her with his finger. Tung immediately removed his hand and said that he had no right to do that at all and asked who he was anyway. But the man did not want to answer this question. He approached the poor girl, who was still shaking with fear, and hugged her in order to calm her down. When the guy saw this, he was immediately surprised. And after that, unceremoniously not paying attention to manners, he asked if they were really a couple. The girl was silent for a while. She did not know whether she should tell the truth or whether it would be better to remain silent. But soon she finally admitted that it was true. Her parents were against this union, citing the fact that her boyfriend was a beggar, and that was why they forced her to come to this terrible meeting. Tung thought about it when he heard this, and wondered if this was the reason why her dear lover had been watching them from afar. The girl immediately nodded her head in agreement. Then the guy replied that it was time for him to go, because he still needed to talk to his parents and figure everything out. The girl's lover asked if he would tell them because he grabbed him by the neck. He was ready to accept his fate, but also asked Tung not to drag the girl into this whole situation. He explained that he could take full responsibility. When the doctor heard these words, he laughed again, but after that he said that they could rest easy, because he would simply tell them that their meeting had failed because he simply had not come there. As soon as they went outside, the boy and the girl decided to see him off. The man who almost attacked him bowed, thanked him for his help and for not telling anything. Tung said that there was nothing wrong with that and also asked him not to bow anymore, as it made him a little wary. After this, the guy turned to his beloved girl and, taking her hands, said that he had decided to talk to her parents about their relationship. She, of course, was immediately happy to hear this and could not believe her happiness. But the guy continued to stay there and coughed to remind her of himself. The lover immediately asked him for forgiveness and said that they were just too happy, and the girl then suggested that his parents would probably also worry him a lot about this situation. She thought they could help him somehow. Tung actually thought about it, but said that his not showing up for the meeting was a common occurrence, and he was sure they had completely forgotten about it. The girl immediately calmed down when she heard this. She bowed and thanked him for helping her after all, and not insisting on everything. Tung immediately said that she really shouldn't thank him so much because he himself didn't like this turn of events. After that, he turned around and started to leave, wishing this beautiful couple great happiness in their personal lives. On the way, he stopped by that coffee shop and ordered himself a coffee so that at least he wouldn't leave empty-handed. And as he started walking back to the parking lot, he finally realized with relief that he actually enjoyed not having to go on a date that his parents had arranged. When Tung passed other cars, he suddenly noticed some strange people. This made him wary, because they were the ones who were following him, deliberately hiding. He immediately thought that since they had already come, they should show themselves right away, because he didn't have much time for all these games of hide and seek. And these strangers really didn't make him wait long. Pretty quickly, one of the guys jumped out and swung his leg at him. Tung managed to turn his head in time. He, of course, dodged this blow, but managed to notice some familiar symbol on the sole. But as soon as he turned his head to the side, he saw that many more different guys in suits started running towards him. They had clubs in their hands, and they were all going to beat him. Because there were too many of them, Tung really couldn't handle them. He couldn't believe that these people didn't even have a sense of conscience, since they attacked one person in a huge crowd. However, at that moment, he also heard a shout behind him, which stood up for him. He immediately turned around to see what was going on there. And looking back, Tung saw the very girl he was supposed to meet. She put her hands on her hips and asked how they dared to attack him. The girl also told them to leave immediately if they valued their lives. She really hoped that idiots like them wouldn't ruin her brand new manicure. That's why the girl asked them to be careful, because later they would definitely beg for mercy. One of the hooligans, when he looked at the defender of Tung, was very surprised. The girl had her hair down, she was wearing a dress, and she also had very thin arms and legs. The man did not understand how she dared to threaten them in such a state. The girl kept saying that they would regret it, and that it was better for them not to get involved with her. But he wasn't going to take her words seriously, so he swung at Tung with renewed force and said that he would continue to beat him anyway. The girl was shocked by this. She became even more angry and, calling him an idiot, asked how he dared to hit him again after all her warnings. The guy who was in love with her appeared behind her and asked her to calm down. However, this girl could no longer be stopped. All because these hooligans began to threaten that when they finished with Tung, they would take her too. Therefore, she immediately ran towards them to attack and very skillfully managed to kick the bully with just one foot so hard that he flew back several meters. Tung, when he saw this, was amazed. In fact, he himself could have dealt with these hooligans, but there were too many of them, and the girl helped him a lot. Soon, the two of them began beating these men, and her boyfriend joined them, already holding a knife in his hands, which he always carried with him. He personally approached the man who was shouting threats at the girl and took proper revenge on him for it. When she saw her lover also on the battlefield, she immediately turned to him and said that he was a little late. Huyan smiled and asked her for forgiveness, and said that he was already here, and that was the most important thing. After that, the three of them dealt with everyone in a very short time. Of course, it was quite difficult, but they managed to cope. So when the fight was finally over, Tung turned to the two of them, thanked them for their help, and apologized for causing them trouble. The man explained that he never thought that his friend would send people again to do harm. The girl immediately said that there was nothing wrong with it because he had helped them, and so they decided to thank him in this way. But at that moment, she turned her attention to her hand and noticed that her manicure was ruined. The girl was simply furious because she liked it so much. And besides, she had made it recently, and now it was already ruined. Huyan tried to calm her down, telling her not to worry so much because they would go make a new one right away. The girl, of course, burst into tears, but she was somewhat consoled by the fact that she would be able to redo it. Tung began to move away from them, and before finally heading home, he looked at this sweet couple again. He even felt a little sad, but the guy was pleased to realize that there are such loving people in this world. A few hours later, he finally returned home, and as soon as he opened the door, Another weapon was thrown at him. This time, it was a frying pan. He, of course, was not surprised that something was flying at him, but he was more surprised that this time it was a frying pan and not something sharp and cutting. His father began scolding his son again, asking why he had returned so early. He immediately assumed that he must have done something wrong while meeting the girl. He didn't have time to finish all the threats he wanted to convey to his son when suddenly his mother ran out and shut her husband's mouth. The woman turned to Tung and, smiling, asked if he had really returned so early, and also suggested that something had displeased him, and that was why he had not stayed on the date. The man, walking forward and without even greeting his parents, sighed heavily and said that his father was right. He simply didn't come that day. Tung was very dejected and told his parents that if they wanted to kill him because of this, it didn't matter to him. They could do it. The mother sighed heavily and said that since he really didn't want it, they wouldn't force him, because he was already an adult and could make decisions on his own. When the boy heard these words, he was so surprised that he even stopped. He looked at his mother and asked what was wrong with her, because she had never said such a thing before. But the woman replied that he had heard everything correctly. He could already make decisions on his own. And then she changed the subject of the conversation and asked her son if he remembered what day it would be at the end of the week. Tung, of course, had no memory problems and could easily remember his mother's birthday, so he replied that, of course, it would be her holiday. The woman immediately became very happy and, coming closer to him and hugging him tightly, said that he was a great guy. And in order to capture this beautiful day, they decided to take the whole family on a trip to Nguyen. Father himself was very surprised when he heard this, not to mention Tung. His mother was just dancing with joy and talking about how they would all go to that place together on a high-speed train and would walk there all the time and have fun. Tung interrupted her and said that it would certainly be a lot of fun, but he would not go with them. When Mother heard this, she froze in place. Slowly turning her head towards him, she asked him what he was even talking about. For a moment, she couldn't accept the fact that he really wasn't going to go with them to her birthday party. The woman was hysterical. She did not understand why her dear son was saying such words to her. And also, turning to her husband, she asked, "Have I really deserved to be treated like this?" The father became very angry with his son and started yelling at him too, asking, "Is this really how you're going to take care of your mother?" He also asked why he didn't think about her tender feelings. His mother continued to cry. She said that so many years had passed, she was the only one he had, and she was incredibly upset that Tung did not want to take care of her at all. Therefore, she saw no point in living on. She continued to play the show, saying that she was already dying at that very moment. So the guy couldn't stand the pressure and said that he still agreed, but it would only be once. After this, he yelled at his parents, telling them to go away now and leave him alone, because he still had some things to do. Some time passed since then, and they really did go on this long-awaited trip as a family for their mother's birthday. Tung walked around all the time with a very dissatisfied expression on his face and always stayed behind his mom and dad. In fact, it was incredibly hot where they arrived, and even though the guy was dressed quite lightly, he was still sweating a lot. They were also accompanied by a girl who showed them around the area. While Tung was talking to his father, his mother approached the girl and asked if she liked her son. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised, laughed awkwardly, and said that their son looked very much like her ex-husband. But she also added that she was absolutely sure that he was much better than her ex-husband. However, she still had no desire to meet anyone new. The woman was quite cunning, so, laughing along with the conductor, she said that it was still possible to get married one more time. Tung had excellent hearing and was very angry when he heard his mother talking like this. His father tried to console him and said that she just cared about him very much, that's all. Soon they came to a rather ancient gate, and there they heard the voice of the guide, who said that this point was included in their excursion. He also said that this is the palace that once belonged to King Ho Hong, since he had control over everything After some time, he decided to create an education system, as well as amendments to the legislation regarding various issues. As soon as the family and everyone else went inside, they saw the paintings of that time. All these fine arts entered the world history of the country. Also in this room, there were precious decorations of that time which were simply priceless. The guide gave people some time to walk around and look at it all carefully, and soon she said that they could now go to the beautiful garden of this palace. People immediately followed her, and while the crowd was bustling about, Tung took advantage of this wonderful opportunity and slipped away from his relatives, running off somewhere to the side. As he walked through the bushes, he was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief and be glad that no one noticed that he had left. And as soon as Tung turned his head to the side and walked along one of the rowan trees, he came out into an incredible place. The view from that place was simply breathtaking. He even thought that he was lost because the excursion definitely did not include a visit to this wonderful place. And for some time, he stood simply in silence, enjoying this view, when suddenly he heard a cry in the distance behind him. The guy immediately became very wary. He did not understand what it was, but decided to go a little to the side and see what had happened. And soon he saw that there was a couple standing not far from him. The girl screamed joyfully and said that she was very glad that they tied the ribbon on the tree. This girl believed in all sorts of such signs, so when she tied a ribbon on a tree, she believed that the heavens would keep their love forever and they would stay together. Tung, when he saw this, sighed heavily, because he did not like to look at such happy couples. And even more so, he did not think that such superstitious people still remained. But at that moment, while he was passing by that very tree, he suddenly heard that someone was distracting him again. This time he was called directly. As soon as the guy turned his head to the side to see who it was, he was very surprised. And all because right under the tree there was an old woman. She turned to him and asked if he wanted to buy a silk ribbon for himself. When he heard all this and saw that she was directly selling these silk ribbons to everyone, he was very surprised. Tung could barely contain his anger. He started to walk away from her, waving his hand and politely thanking her, saying that he certainly didn't need it. But in reality, he didn't understand how he could be offered something like that all the time. But then the woman suddenly asked him to stop because she had just recently seen his ribbon on this tree. Tung, hearing this, immediately became interested. He stopped and waited for a while, and the old woman asked him if he believed in these tapes at all. The man turned towards her, and so as not to seem stupid, he smiled, but replied that of course he did not believe in all this. Granny also smiled happily and turned around, going back to her stall. She said that everyone in this world has their own destiny, and there is always a reason for everything that happens. The woman also said that absolutely everything can change in one moment when you meet the Holy Spirit. She came up to him, took one of the tapes and said that it didn't matter at all whether he believed in all of this or not, but everyone had their own specific tape. And if you really want it, you can definitely change it. Tung laughed at that moment and said that these were just simple words. He believed that if a person achieves his success, then he himself decides what to do and what not to do, and it does not matter at all whether it is fate or some Holy Spirit. He said that everyone has a chance to succeed, and everything depends only on the person himself and not on fate, which is already predetermined. Tung knew that this whole topic had been discussed for many years, and of course, during all this time no one had ever seen the Holy Spirit. So many began to doubt that it was true and considered it to be just empty words. But at the moment he said the last phrase, some strange vision appeared before his eyes. And in this vision there was a beautiful girl with white hair. She was standing by the same tree as him at that moment. And after that some guy appeared who was able to save her. Tung couldn't believe that all this was really happening. He had never seen such visions before, but at that moment, his head suddenly began to hurt and he fell to the ground. The vision left him rather quickly, but he continued to doubt what had happened at all, as well as how to explain it all. At that moment, an elderly woman approached him. She put her hand on his shoulder and asked if he was okay. The man was able to cope with his emotions quite quickly. He quickly turned to her and said that he was fine, but he still did not understand what it was. The woman, without thinking twice, handed him a bottle of water and told him to drink a little, because then he would feel better. Tung replied that he was indeed fine, and that this was too much. He actually didn't trust this woman at all, and wanted to avoid her. But the granny smiled and said that he shouldn't worry. This water was definitely not poisoned. It was a bottle that had been bought quite recently from a vending machine that was nearby. The man hesitated for a while, but eventually he took the water from her and thanked her. He really wanted to drink it like crazy. He quickly opened the bottle and took a few big gulps, after which he exhaled with relief. He could not understand what had been happening to him all day because he constantly felt strange. For a while they were both silent, and then the woman came closer to him and said that this was a divine tree, and kings and queens once spent time next to this tree, looking at the sea. It was also believed that this was their secret place, and no one knew about it. It was just the two of them. Tung didn't react at all. He put the bottle down on the ground when he was done drinking and simply stood up from his seat. He shook the dirt off his clothes and started to leave. The woman was very surprised and asked why he was leaving so quickly. Didn't he really want to hear her story to the end? The guy asked her for forgiveness and said that he did not have so much time to listen to various legends. Of course, the woman wasn't surprised. She sighed heavily and said that the guys were so busy lately, and also asked him to be careful because he might get into trouble. Tung was very skeptical about these words and laughed and said that nothing like this had happened in his life, so everything would definitely be fine, and he believed that he had nothing to worry about. As soon as he walked a little further, he suddenly heard the cries of his relatives who were just looking for him. The guy, seeing them, immediately realized that they had freed themselves and started looking for him, noticing the loss, so he panicked a lot. This woman also noticed these people and said that they might want to listen to her story, so she got their attention. The guy, of course, panicked. He understood that he needed to hide so that his parents wouldn't see him, so he decided to run behind the counter with those very ribbons. By that time, Tung's parents had already approached the woman and asked if she had seen a tall, fair-haired guy. At that moment, he sat and was very nervous because he didn't know if this granny would be able not to give him away. He didn't want her to do that. The woman didn't want to set this guy up, so she said that she didn't see anyone after all. However, Tung's mother began to get nervous and said that perhaps her son had been captured and simply taken away from this place. The woman did not worry because she knew that her son was a very good fighter. But the conductor continued to panic and said that maybe he had already died and gone to the next world, or something even worse had happened. Father Tung at this point approached his wife and said that she certainly had everything, even beauty. However, he did not like the way she panicked and thought in stressful situations. Some time passed from that moment, and his parents moved on. When Tung heard that the conversations had died down, he immediately looked out from behind the counter and asked Granny if they had left. The woman said that they had left. Then he came closer to her and thanked her for not giving him up after all. As a sign of his gratitude and appreciation, he began to take out a small amount of money. She was a little surprised when she saw the bills because she had done absolutely nothing, but she decided to do it her way. So she handed the ribbon to the guy, telling him to take it in that case, because it belonged to him. Tung immediately began to protest and said that he did not need it, because this money was not for purchase at all. It was gratitude, and she was not obliged to give him anything in exchange. But she continued to hand him this ribbon and asked him to at least just look at it. The guy doubted for a while, but then he realized that one way or another she had helped him, so he would take one ribbon to please her. There was nothing wrong with that anyway. Therefore, he immediately took the ribbon that the granny gave him, and as soon as it was in his hands, a light breeze blew, which brought pleasant aromas. Then the old woman asked him to make a wish, and then throw it on a tree. If the ribbon fell on a branch, it meant that the divine had accepted his wish. Tung, when he heard this, was very surprised. He looked again at this tape and did not understand why he had to throw it. And besides, there was a rather strong wind blowing, which swayed all these tapes. But he decided to really check. The guy made a wish and thought that if this was all true, then he wanted his cherished wish to come true. After thinking about this wish many times, he threw the ribbon onto the tree and it immediately caught on a branch, despite the wind. For a while he just stood there looking up, waiting. But when nothing happened, he became convinced that it was all just a lie. Tung never doubted for a moment that he would be right. So as he turned around and left, he thought that this life is reality, and there have never been and never will be miracles in the world. However, at that moment, he suddenly heard the voice of this woman. Even though he had moved as far away as possible, she said that his wish had been accepted and was incredibly happy. He immediately looked at her, and she repeated those words again about his wish being accepted. And then she came closer to him and touched his backpack, and at that moment, he felt somehow strange. Everything around him lit up, and his soul seemed to separate from his body for a while. However, this did not happen only for a while. His body fell, and he could see himself. The guy began to panic, not understanding why this was happening, and the grandmother simply walked away from him, smiling. Tung was in a panic. He did not understand what had happened. And when he looked at his hand, he saw that it was translucent, just like his whole body. He did not feel like a real person. The next part of the story will tell about another world where a furious battle was going on, and it took place in Thandon. The people around were running away from arrows and fire. They had to find shelter for themselves in order to survive. The warriors invaded the city. They wanted to destroy the gates of the fortress in order to enter inside and capture the territory. Other people, ordinary civilians who were not even dressed in military uniform, held these gates from the other side so that the enemies could not get through to them under any circumstances. One of the warriors who defended his city turned to his father, who was the commander-in-chief. He said that in such a situation, they would be able to hold out for a very short time, and then the city would simply fall. They would not be able to sacrifice people and hold the wall anymore. When the man heard this, he was very surprised and asked, "But what about reinforcements? They were supposed to come to them." But the guy replied that the fastest and closest reinforcements were 60 miles away from the city and were not due to arrive until the next morning. The warriors and people who were holding the gates said that this was very bad because others were about to destroy them and break through. The man understood that the situation was very tense. He understood that even if reinforcements arrived, they still would not be able to cope because there were too many enemies. Then he couldn't take it anymore and screamed at the top of his lungs that perhaps their family really was finished and they should give up. His son, when he heard these words, was very surprised because his dad never gave up. He always went to the last and always won. He said that if they pulled out the troops, the people in the city would simply die. They would not let them survive, and their nation would completely perish. The man was shocked by the situation that was happening. His people, whom he should protect, wanting to live, are leaving the fortress because they are afraid of death. After some thought, he finally made a final decision. The man was not going to surrender to the enemy so easily. Therefore, taking his sword in his hands, he said that their Jiang family would have eternal glory, even if he had to die. However, at that moment a fair-haired girl came running to them. She was addressing her father and older brother and looked very worried. As soon as the men saw her, they were very surprised. The father immediately turned to Bongok and asked why she had come to the battlefield at all, since she was supposed to be sitting in cover. But not having received an answer from her, he turned to the maid, who was always supposed to be nearby and guard the girl, and asked, "Didn't I order Bongok to be taken out of the fortress?" Then suddenly his daughter, with tears in her eyes, asked her father not to blame her because she herself did not want to leave. It was all her fault. When the man heard this, he was ready to burst into tears himself because it was hard for him to hear all these words. However, having gathered his strength, he turned to Bongok and said that she was their family's last hope. So he asked her to leave and under no circumstances return, because it was too dangerous. The girl continued to cry. She did not understand how she should leave at all, because she was leaving her whole life, her whole family on the battlefield, and was left alone in safety. However, at this point, the blows on the other side of the wall were becoming stronger. The soldiers had already begun to retreat because they understood that the fortress gates were about to fall. Fee quickly grabbed her mistress by the hand and started to run away, and her father said in their direction that she should take her mistress to the tunnel and leave immediately, as quickly as possible, and under no circumstances turn around. Bangog continued to cry and scream. She said that she would not go anywhere without her father and brother, and she did not intend to leave them alone. However, at the moment when the next blow to the wall occurred, the girl lost consciousness, and all because her brother cast a special spell on her so that she would sleep and not resist. Her father immediately turned to the assistant and said that he trusted his daughter to her and she was obliged to save her life, no matter what the cost. Fee, having bowed, immediately said that she would do everything and at all costs protect the lady, and after that she took the girl, and they left anyway. She mounted her horse and rode faster than the wind to save her mistress. Of course, she felt incredibly sorry for her homeland, and she prayed that the city wall, Master Baolong, and everyone would survive. The commander-in-chief, who continued to stand at the top, saw her and his daughter moving away on the horizon, and the wall continued to collapse. And after some time, one of the warriors who continued to hold the defense said that the city gates were destroyed, which meant that very soon the enemies would run inside. The soldiers immediately turned to their general, asking what they should do. They asked him to give them an order so that they would know how to defend themselves. But for a while, the men just watched in silence. And then he drew the soldiers' attention to himself and told them to hold their weapons tightly. The man spoke about how they were loyal soldiers of their country. They swore to their people and country that they would defend to the last, so they were obliged to preserve the fortress and hold the defense, no matter what it cost them. The soldiers were immediately inspired by this speech and said that, of course, they would defend the eastern fortress. And so in December of that same year, this poor and unfortunate city was occupied by the blood of the enemy and soldiers, but in return, it was peace for its people and hundreds of families. The soldiers kept their oath using their flesh and blood while defending Tandong Fortress. They did not retreat even a step and were very courageous. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fee took her to a safe place where the sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the atmosphere was very calm and peaceful. The girl did not wake up for a long time, but when she finally found herself safe and came to her senses, she suddenly jumped to her feet. She started screaming about where her father and older brother were, where their city was, where the wall was. She was completely lost in space and time at that moment. Fee tried to calm her down. She told the lady that they had already left the city, so she definitely wouldn't be able to see them anytime soon. Bangog, when she heard this, immediately looked to the side and saw that far away on the horizon there was a column of smoke. She immediately realized that this was the place where the most terrible battle was taking place. The girl stood up and started screaming loudly. She wanted to run in that direction, but her maid managed to stop her in time and asked her to calm down, because she shouldn't be so nervous. However, Bangog continued to resist. She asked the girl to let her go because they had to go back. She should not leave her family and friends there. Soon she managed to break free from her maid's grasp, and Fee began to scream, saying that they could not go back there. She must remember the general's words and understand that there was no way back for them. The lady continued to insist on her own. She ran forward and said that they should go. However, at one point she suddenly felt something pierce her body. It turned out to be an arrow, and the girl immediately stopped. She didn't even scream sharply because she didn't immediately understand that pain. And Fee, when she saw that she stopped and saw the arrow, immediately ran to her. The assistant screamed loudly and swore. She ran up to the lady and grabbing her began to ask her to wake up, because Bangog had already lost consciousness. But at that moment, the woman heard some rustling nearby in the bushes. Turning her head, she immediately realized that the man who had shot her mistress with an arrow was probably there. She threw her hairpin, which was very sharp, in that direction and told him to die. After all, it was wrong to do that. It was wrong to hurt Bongog. The guy, who just happened to peek out from behind the bushes to see what was going on, got this pin right in the head and died on the spot. At that moment, the lady opened her eyes briefly. Her body was shaking. She felt simply disgusting. Blood was coming out of her mouth and she was very cold. Fee immediately began to cry. She turned to her beloved mistress and asked her not to die, not to leave her alone. But Bongog smiled happily and told the girl not to cry, because everything would be fine, that everything would work out. She made a promise that she would meet her father and older brother. And with these thoughts, the girl closed her eyes. Her body began to leave this world because the arrow was too deep, and she lost a lot of blood. When Fee saw her beloved mistress take her last breath, she screamed loudly from the injustice. She did not understand how this was even possible, and most importantly, why. Then the woman made a difficult decision for herself, but she considered it the right one. Fee took her sword, which she had used for self-defense, and for the sake of the young master general and her mistress, she was ready to follow and serve everyone. Therefore, she was going to leave with them. But at the moment when the girl brought the sword to her throat to cut it, Bongog suddenly woke up and sat up. The girl was confused. She looked around and asked who she was, where she was, and also who Fee was, who was sitting in front of her. But Bongog, having looked more closely at the clothes of the girl opposite, immediately asked, "Is this really some kind of filming of a movie from ancient times? After all, she has not seen such clothes for a long time." After that, the girl turned her gaze to herself. She began to examine her body from head to toe and did not understand why her clothes were exactly the same. And then she suddenly noticed that she had breasts. At that moment, she almost screamed in surprise because she had never had breasts. Bongog was so alarmed and surprised only because it was not she. It was Tung, whose soul had migrated into the body of this girl with the help of that strange old woman. And as soon as the guy finally realized this, he was shocked. He even thought that this was some kind of time travel from the stupid novels that he periodically saw on the internet. However, at that moment, Fee, who realized what had happened, immediately ran up to her mistress and began to hug her tightly. She said that she was very glad that she was alive again. Fee burst into tears again and said that she was incredibly happy because she almost decided to commit suicide along with all her owners to show them her loyalty. The guy tried to understand this whole situation in surprise, but it was beyond his powers. His assistant immediately moved away from him and said that she was probably still injured, so she needed to take off her dress as soon as possible to examine the wound and treat it. But as soon as they started to undress her, he immediately removed her hands from himself and asked in a rough voice what she was going to do anyway. Fee was surprised by the lady's reaction. She explained that she was just going to heal the wounds, that's all, and nothing more. But the guy kept screaming. He said that he definitely didn't have any wounds, so there was no need to do that. Of course, his assistant was not going to lag behind, so she began to tear off his clothes little by little, and was surprised that the girl was still embarrassed. Soon, when a piece of his dress was torn, he looked down and saw a really small hole that was left from the arrow strike. The man became wary. He didn't understand where it came from because his chest was completely intact, but he also quickly became embarrassed when he realized that a little more and he would be completely naked. Fee carefully examined the place without taking her eyes off it. She was very surprised and did not understand how this was even possible, because when she pulled out the arrow, she saw blood. The guy quickly covered his body and said that he had already said that there were no wounds, and asked how she could even allow herself to behave like that. The maid began to cry again. She put her hands together and looked at the sky and said that the heavens see. They see good people, so they want to save them. The woman also said that it was all thanks to the blessing of the ancestors that the lady was alive. She said that it was a great miracle and incredible happiness for all of them. Tung sat silently the whole time. He thought this girl was incredibly strange and didn't understand what was wrong with her, because she really was acting suspiciously. However, at that moment, someone's voice was heard behind them, saying that they needed to find them. Of course, he meant the lady and her assistant by these words. Fee immediately rose to her feet. She turned to her mistress and said that the situation was very urgent, so they had to leave immediately, and all the congratulations and joys had to be left for later. Tung was about to answer her, but at that moment his assistant picked him up and threw him over her shoulder so quickly that he didn't even have time to do anything. The guy lay on her shoulder and did not understand how this girl could be so strong, because even he, perhaps in some moments, could be weaker than her. At that moment, Fee had already managed to approach the horse and sat the lady's body there. She told the girl to hold on tighter, and at that moment she herself jumped on the horse, ordering it to move. Tung was so surprised that he almost fell off his horse. However, at that moment the warriors had already managed to come to their place. They immediately noticed the girls and began to pursue them, because they had to take hostages for themselves. When the guy in the girl's body turned around and saw the soldiers, he was very surprised. He immediately assumed that there was a war in the place where he found himself, and for some reason they were being pursued. One of the warriors immediately began shouting to everyone else to give chase, because whoever caught the general's daughter alive would be rewarded. When the men heard this, they immediately rejoiced and sped up, because they really wanted to receive a reward for such an act. But Tung, of course, was not happy about this turn of events, because he had just woken up, and now they were chasing him with a reward. And he was not sure whether they would leave him alive at all. He couldn't understand what time period he found himself in. But of course, he couldn't ask his assistant such questions, because there was a whole army of warriors galloping after them. The only thing he understood by that moment was that he had somehow been turned into a girl, dragged onto a horse, and now they wanted to kill him. Suddenly, one of the villains caught the girl's eye and called her a beauty. He invited her to gallop with them so that they could receive a reward. Fee, when she heard that her mistress was being pestered, immediately knew that she had to act. So she took out a few more hairpins from her arsenal, which were incredibly sharp. The girl, without thinking twice, pointed all three things at the warriors and was immediately able to throw them off their pursuit. Tung, seeing this movement, was very surprised. He thought that his ally was quite skillful in killing people, and very unceremoniously, so he still had doubts about what kind of barbaric time he had been transported to. However, at that moment, an arrow flew from a completely different direction. Fortunately, it did not hit any of the girls, but it did pierce the horse's body, which screamed loudly in pain. Of course, the horse could not stay on its feet for long, so it quickly threw the people off itself, and having run some more distance, fell down dead. Tung also flew a few meters and, hitting a rock, fell to the ground. He screamed for help and uttered various insults because he was in a state of shock. Because he hit the ground so quickly and sharply, his shoulder was injured. He sat motionless for a while and then began to look around to find his ally. Fee was nearby. She was coughing loudly, and when he saw her, he finally breathed a sigh of relief, because he was glad that she was okay and had also rolled down like him. The moment the assistant raised her head up, she saw danger. She immediately turned to the lady and told her to turn around and be careful. Tung was very surprised when he heard this. He slowly turned his head and saw behind him the very warrior who had been flirting with him. The man laughed happily, called her a beauty, and asked where they were trying to escape to, because he had no intention of harming them. Tung was in a panic. He didn't understand why this pervert was so attached to him and couldn't leave him alone. However, the warrior, continuing to laugh, reached out to him and, calling him a beauty, said that she was truly incredibly beautiful. He was going to do some truly horrible things to the lady before handing her over and getting his reward, and he didn't even hide the fact. However, Tung, who was a professional in hand-to-hand combat, hit the man in the face so hard that he flew several meters and even crashed into his teammates. Blood immediately started pouring from his nose, and the guy was ready to even cry because of the severe pain, which he was not even used to. His friends were immediately very surprised at how quickly he gave in, because just recently he was bragging so much, and then, when a girl hit him, he immediately burst into tears. Tung stood in a fighting stance at this moment, waiting for new enemies to deal with. His assistant, without taking her eyes off, looked at the lady and did not understand what was going on at all. And also, since when the lady had been familiar with martial arts, she had always been ordinary, weak, and very fragile. And then suddenly she fought back against a whole soldier. By that time, the guy had already come to his senses. He stood up and said that this girl turned out to be a mystery. He took his weapon and offered to see how strong she was, since she dared to attack the general himself. When Fee saw him attacking her, she immediately realized that she needed to save him and threw the weapon towards the girl, telling her to take it. Tung caught the sword the first time and thanked his assistant. As soon as he pulled it out of the case, he managed to repel the general's attack in time. When the man saw this, he was very surprised. But fear even appeared on his face because he understood that if she could fight off attacks so professionally, then she probably fought well. Tung did not show his fears, but he was not sure whether he could use the sword with both body and soul, because he had never practiced using such an ancient weapon. However, the guy struck the first blow and was able to immediately knock the sword out of the general's hands. It flew far, far away, so the man certainly would not have been able to grab it. Tung, taking advantage of this opportunity, immediately came closer to him, running his sword along the ground. The man, in a trembling voice, asked what she was going to do with him. The lady pointed her sword at him and said that if he wanted to survive, he had to let them go peacefully. Otherwise, he would regret ever attacking them. Of course, the general was very scared, because the sword was already right next to his throat. She could have directed it a little further, and that would have been it. He would have died that very second. Other people were also scared, so they took advantage of this moment and decided to simply retreat so as not to attract unnecessary attention to themselves. The man thought for a while, but then said that if she said so, then we could try. Tung was about to put away his sword at that moment, but the man took some dirt from the ground and threw it right at her face. He was very surprised by the general's behavior. At that moment, Fee immediately jumped up and ran to the lady, asking if everything was okay with her, because she had covered her face with her hands. The girl looked at her assistant and said that her eyes were fine. It was just dirt. However, her shoulder was dislocated, and she probably wouldn't be able to last long on the battlefield.